This coming fiscal year, 2010-11, is once again expected to present us with a deficit of some $20 billion. It'll be the third year in a row in which we go into the legislative period with very large deficits. The operating budget is $82 million in the governor's proposal for 2010-11, and a budget deficit of $20 billion represents a significant fraction. So it's not a minor issue. In fact, the governor has described this deficit as having to pose to the legislators and to the state a set of choices that are fundamentally draconian. The degrees of freedom, so to speak, to balance the budget through expenditures, expenditure reduction are relatively few. So those few things have to absorb dramatic reductions in expenditure.
On to some specific actions and sort of how we got here. We got here sort of the same way they've created a mess in Washington as well. Very few new revenues. It is, as Fred pointed out, it's very tough to raise taxes here. During my tenure, there were some fees raised, but never any general taxes raised. Taxes haven't been raised for almost 20 years in California now. You typically do have to, have every Democrat and then have a few Republicans vote to raise those taxes. Even though revenues weren't raised, people continued to spend money. And in particular, when one-time revenues came in, people would spend those one-time revenues on ongoing expenditures. And that created a big problem. In fact, the year before I was elected, they had an unexpected $14 billion surplus. $14 billion, and they spent virtually all of it on, or a lot of it, probably two-thirds, on ongoing programs as opposed to one-time programs. So it's very tough. Once you've started issuing those programs or beginning those programs, it's very tough to undo those. And then people said, well, we'll borrow. We're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to raise revenues. We're going to continue to spend. We'll borrow instead. And to the governor's credit, he came along and said, no, we're cutting up the credit card. There was a measure on the ballot. Voters approved it. At least we've done that. But I would also argue that voters have not been that responsible. They've sort of encouraged the legislature to move on because, and this is part of a fault of the initiative process. We can put something on the initiative on the ballot. You don't have to identify how it's going to be paid, how you're going to pay for it, and it passes because everyone likes to spend money. So those are some of the things that have gotten us there. The two-thirds budget is a big problem. One of the things that people tend to overlook is the asymmetry in the system. We require a two-thirds vote to pass a budget and to increase taxes, but only a 50% vote to give money back, to cut taxes. So, for example, with a number of times that's happened where only a simple majority said we're going to cut taxes here or refund monies here, and then if you're in a bad situation maybe a year or two later, it's much tougher to get that back because you've got a two-thirds vote that you've got to actually to do. One of the other structural barriers that exist is that, and again, despite the efforts I think in the governor's office and the Department of Finance in particular to require what I'd call truth in budgeting, there really isn't much truth in budgeting in Sacramento. Very often people, I can tell you after having been through a number of these budget cycles, people vote for and pass these get-out-of-town budgets where you just sort of put up votes and the numbers aren't real, but you're so desperate to get out of Sacramento at the end of the summer that you vote and you move on. One example currently, the budget for the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is the amount that's budgeted in this fiscal year was $8.2 billion. Virtually everyone in Sacramento who follows this at all knows that they are at least $1 billion over budget. So to pass the budget last year, they said, well, we'll pencil in $8.2 billion, we'll deal with the problem later. So you need some sort of a truth in budgeting solution there. Other structural problems that California faces, as everyone knows, highly volatile revenues that come in. Again, we have very often revenue swings where, as I was alluding to or pointed out a minute ago, the year before I was elected, revenues were up $14 billion over what they expected. 18 months later, they were down about $12 billion. I mean, huge swings over a very short amount of time, and that continues to happen. That happens in part because we are so reliant on the personal income tax in California. And I looked back, I said, well, let's see, what's the personal income tax revenue estimated for this year? And it is $47 billion, roughly. What was the personal income tax the first budget I voted on, 10 years ago? $45 billion. So we're roughly, almost exactly where we were 10 years ago. And that tends to swing widely. And again, the problem is that when the revenue comes in, people spend it. When the revenue disappears, they still spend it. They just borrow to get there.
If you look at our projected spending level, it's also substantially lower than earlier projections based on the reductions that have been done in the last couple of budget cycles. That said, our multi-year gap going into the future rises to about almost $23 billion in the year 12-13. So we have, absent action, we have operating deficits from in 10-11, growing in 11-12, growing in 12-13, and then going down a little bit in 13-14. The governor's budget proposes $19.9 billion in solutions to both close the budget gap in the coming year and ensure that we have a balanced budget, as well as to make sure that we close as much of the operating deficit into the future as possible. The reductions are very difficult. It's $8.5 billion in cuts, more than $2 billion in reductions to Health and Human Services, many reductions to in-home supportive services, Medi-Cal, and many of the programs that Joe was speaking to that have rates of growth that are faster than our revenue growth will support. We're looking at reductions in corrections, a lesser rate of increase in funding for education, as well as reductions to employee compensation and across all different areas of government, essentially. The governor is proposing to reform our relationship with the federal government and to secure about $6.9 billion in federal funds. Most of those funds are either associated with taking us to the national average in terms of the rate of funding that other states receive for some of their programs, like the Medicaid program, as well as securing federal funding consistent with the levels that federal law calls for in the area of reimbursing states for the cost of providing services to undocumented immigrants who are incarcerated, as well as the cost for providing for meeting special education mandates. Knowing that those things have been tried in the past and that it's a very heavy lift to get that reform in the federal-state relationship, the governor has identified deeper reductions as well as revenue changes that would be required if the federal funds don't materialize to the level that he's proposing. And the reason for that is to make it very clear that California needs to balance its budget either way, regardless of what happens on the federal funding side. We're looking at another $3.9 billion in what we call alternative funding. It's funding restructuring, like a restructure of how California funds transportation programs in a manner that would benefit the state general fund, different funding sources, an assessment to fund for fire protection services, as well as other proposals. And then we have some fund shifts and other revenues for a total of 19.9. You can see on page 8 that general fund spending would in the proposed level, general fund spending goes to below inflation and remains below an inflation-adjusted budget for 98-99 going forward into the future. And you can see on page 9 that operating shortfalls would go down substantially from the roughly $23 billion in the out year associated with the no action level to somewhere closer to the $5 or $6 billion range. But even with a lot of reductions, California would continue to have challenges into the future that would have to continue to be addressed through reforms and other reductions in coming years.